Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Search Laboratory webinar on how to implement technical SEO for internet. My name is Alan Davis. I'm the Global Marketing Director for Search Laboratory. I'll be hosting the seminar today. Before we dive into the technical detail of today's webinar, for those of you who don't know Search Laboratory, I'll give you a quick introduction. Search Laboratory was founded 10 years ago over in the UK. We were founded from the ground up to be a data-driven company with an in-house facility to deliver international campaigns to multiple markets. We currently have 130 employees. We opened our office in New York 2 years ago to service our North American clients, and clients that would include Hootsuite, Homes.com, Kingston Technology, Oasis, and others. Our agenda for today is we have a 45-minute presentation. We have questions and answers, well, less than 45 minutes. We'll have questions and answers at the end. Please use the chat facility to raise your questions with us. We will share the recording with you at the end of the seminar, so there's no need for you to take screen grabs. I'm delighted to introduce our Head of Technical SEO, Jamie White, who's going to deliver the webinar today. Jamie has been with us for over 3 years. He's an SEO veteran. He's worked in the industry for over 7 years, focusing on off-page, on-page, and account management roles. Jamie has worked on a number of our key international clients, including GoPro, Boohoo, Karen Millen, Oasis, to name a few. He's assisted in technical audits and platform migrations for a large number of websites spanning dozens of countries globally. His key day-to-day responsibilities as Head of Technical SEO include driving our on-page technical SEO offering, managing our resource of specialists in this area, and consulting with the management team on our overall SEO strategy. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Jamie, who can take us through the webinar for today. Jamie.
Thank you, Alan, and hello everyone. So as Alan explained, I'm going to be running through today just some key considerations in terms of moving your site into international markets. Some of the things that I will be talking about include site structuring considerations, some of the pros and cons around this, also thinking about how you might structure your content for different languages and different countries, using the hreflang tag, which is really key in ensuring that the correct content gets in front of your correct audience in their markets, Google Search Console setup and how you can use this to really maximize your international coverage, and then crucially some of the more common mistakes and pitfalls that we have seen some of our clients and prospects fall into, and really how you can avoid these when you're moving internationally. So in terms of site structure, there really are 3 options when moving your site into international markets. We have what's termed a CCTLD, that stands for Country Code Top Level Domain. Some of the examples there are in brackets for the USA, for France, and for Germany. We also have a subfolder approach where everything would be hosted on a global generic domain. In this example I've used .com, and then everything after this will be in the subfolder structure. And then finally we have the subdomain approach, where again everything is on the generic top-level domain, however it's a subdomain approach as opposed to a subfolder approach. This image here just gives you an idea of some of the real sort of benefits and disadvantages to some of these approaches. I won't go into all of these in detail in this presentation, however I will run through some of the key ones. We will share this blog post and tweet this out as well during the webinar, so this is accessible easily for anyone who does wish to look at this in a lot more detail. However, I will start to go into some of these top-level considerations now for each of the 3 approaches. So the first approach, country code top-level domain, The example that I've used here is Coca-Cola. You can see their UK website, Italian and Spanish websites on the right-hand side. The main benefit of this approach is that it's an extremely strong location signal to Google and to all search engines in terms of the audience that you want to target and the country in which they reside. Another really strong advantage, it does have a real trust element amongst your audience. There are certain markets that we have dealt with and through our experience really do benefit and really do favour their own country's top-level domain. France is a prime example. They're really much more inclined to click on a .fr domain rather than a .com with a French subfolder, for example. In terms of some of the disadvantages of this approach, there are increased linking, promotional and outreach efforts required because Google will view all of these websites as completely separate websites and completely separate domains as they are. So even though you may link them all together and pass some authority between them, it's sometimes not enough, and each of these domains by itself will require its own linking and promotional campaign. One of the other drawbacks is the purchase and maintenance cost of each of these separate domains. You have to buy, renew and host each of these separate websites depending on the extent of your international coverage. The second approach that I'm just going to talk about here is the subfolder approach. One brand that utilizes this very well is Apple. So you can see on the right hand side they've got their Australian, their French and their Brazilian subfolders here, all hosted on the apple.com top-level domain. The biggest advantage of this approach is that the link authority of that domain and any pages within that domain, it's all shared. So if Apple was suddenly to launch into a new market with a new subfolder, that subfolder would start to see some real short-term and medium-term gains from the link authority that that domain already holds. That's contrary to the previous approach that I was talking about, where that would be a unique site by itself and it really wouldn't benefit as much from the authority that the other sites had built up. One of the other advantages of this approach is much lower purchase and maintenance cost. You're purchasing one domain and you're hosting it once and you only have to renew it once. So it's much cheaper than taking the previous approach. Probably one of the biggest disadvantages of this approach is it's potentially a much lower trust factor amongst your audience. So when someone's looking at your URL within search results, they don't see any indication of their country until they've got right to the end of the domain or right to the end of the URL. So there is an element of lower trust there and potentially lower click-through rates. And also it is a much weaker location signal compared to the country top-level domain. Google will not look at any of these on this Apple example and immediately understand that it's for Australia, France or Brazil, because you can create a subfolder or a subpage on a website that contains absolutely any combination of characters. So there's no real indication that it's definitely for France or definitely for Brazil. So we do have to take extra steps to ensure that that's understood. The final approach is the subdomain. So a brand that utilizes this well is wikipedia.org. So everything is on the main wikipedia.org domain with subdomains used, in this case English, German and Portuguese. One of the advantages of this approach is that each subdomain can be hosted on a different server around the world. So the English one could be hosted in England or the USA, Germany in German and Portuguese in Portugal. So there is that advantage. There's also the lower purchase and maintenance cost versus by purchasing an individual top-level domain for each country you want to target. And there is some degree of link authority sharing from that main top-level domain. So wikipedia.org, all the subdomains and all the subpages on it will see some benefit, but it's certainly not as strong as the subfolder approach that I've talked about so far. Some of the disadvantages, because the link authority sharing is not as strong as taking the subfolder approach, you still have to put some increased linking and promotional efforts into maintaining and really growing the visibility of these websites. And also, even though each subdomain can be hosted in a separate country, it is still a much weaker location signal compared to having that unique country code top-level domain such as a .co.uk or a .fr. So subdomain really, in my opinion, sits in between the two. It doesn't really have the strong benefits of one, but nor does it have the strong sort of disadvantages of the other. So moving on from domain structure, I'm just going to talk a bit now about content structure and really the two approaches that you're bound to take with your content on your international website. The first approach would be to have multiple single language content targeting different locations. An example would be 4 pages of English content all targeting the US, Ireland, Great Britain and Australia. You might also have fully translated content which targets different languages and potentially different countries as well. Example would be 4 pages of content, one in English, one in French, one in Italian and one in Spanish. Now, depending on the structure of the domain and the structure of the website, there might not be enough information here for search engines to understand exactly how to rank this content. So we really need to give it as much of a helping hand as possible to ensure that our English content is served to English users and our French content to French users and so on. And the way that we can do this is utilizing the hreflang tag. So this is a piece of HTML code that primarily would appear in the head section of any web page within the source code. That's always been the traditional approach to implementing hreflang. However, more recently we've seen a lot of instances where this has been included in the XML sitemap file, which again is a totally legitimate way of applying this. Now I'll talk about how you might do this taking either approach and why one might be beneficial over the other. What the hreflang tag does, it helps Google serve the correct content to users based on their language and potentially their location if applicable. Now the 2 examples that I've gone through previously are 2 prime examples where you would want to use hreflang. Duplicate content with very small language variations, so 4 versions of English content for different countries, but also fully translated content in multiple languages, even though the content is fundamentally different, as in the letters and the words on the page are different, we still need to use hreflang to make sure that Google will serve it correctly based on the language that our audience are speaking in. So to run through these examples, the first one that I'm going to talk about is that duplicate content approach. So if we've got small language variations, maybe the use of different currency or different delivery or shipping options or even a different telephone number on the page, that might not be enough for Google to differentiate between the different locations for which this content is targeted at. So assuming we have our 4 English pages all targeting our generic product, Google is in the middle of this thinking which of these pieces of English content, because they are all English, they are all duplicates, which of these should it rank for the phrase widgets? One of the outcomes of this, which we certainly don't want, is for it to pick just one of these and rank it in all markets, particularly if your predominant market is the US. We certainly don't want it to be picking the content that's targeted against Australia and simply ranking that everywhere. The really worst case scenario would be if Googlebot just couldn't decide between all of these and decided to rank some pages from your competition instead, which is certainly not what we want to see. So what we would use is the hreflang tag. Now this is an example of the hreflang tag as it would be applied within the physical source code of the page. Now I'm just going to break this down so we can understand exactly what's happening within this code. So we've got 4 lines of hreflang code here targeting our 4 different versions of English content. This section of the code is basically saying we have alternate versions of this piece of content. This section is saying this is where they are located. This part here is saying this is the language of those pieces of content, and this section here is saying it's specifically for users in this country. So now Googlebot has a really good idea, a really good understanding that even though all these pieces of content are 99% identical and duplicates of one another, we know now that they're targeted for users in different countries and it can rank them accordingly. Now an important part to note about the hreflang code is that it is primarily a language tag, so the language section of this piece of code is required always. However, in this case, simply stating that all 4 of these are in English wouldn't really help Google because it can probably understand that anyway. What we need to do in this case is use this optional country tag to say one's for the US, one's for Ireland, one's for Australia, and one's for the United Kingdom. Another example where this would be used is using fully translated content on our website, simply in multiple languages. So we have our American English, French, Italian, and also Spanish content. Googlebot in the middle, perhaps not having enough information to rank this content correctly. One of the prime examples where we see this falling down is if you have multilingual content for a country that speaks multiple languages, such as Canada with French and English, or Switzerland with French and Italian, for example. This is where this really comes into use. So again, this is an example of the hreflang code, so everything looks pretty much the same. The URLs are slightly different because we've got French, Spanish and Italian in this case. And what we've been able to do in this example is only use the language tag, and what we're saying is one's for English users, one's for French users, one's for Spanish users, and so on. Now this would apply globally. So if we had a French user in France or Switzerland or Canada, they would be served with that French content. We could expand this tag and include a country code as well if we wanted to. We're saying here English users in the USA, French in France, Spanish in Spain, and so on and so on. So that just shows you the two different examples where you might use only the language tag or where you might want to restrict it only to that country. So it just goes to show that using this tag really needs to come with some consideration, because you could massively open up your content to users who you don't want to see it, or you could massively restrict your content from users who you do want to see it. Googlebot now has a really good understanding of the content that we've got on our site and can easily rank this based on the language that people are searching in and the country from which they're searching. Another element of the hreflang tag is using hreflang equals x default. Now this would be for content that's not specific to any particular language. So good examples of where you might use this would be a country selector page or a catch-all page, and it basically accounts for any users who aren't satisfied by the previous codes of hreflang. This is an example piece of code that I've mocked up for our website example.com. So if we had a country selector page that was located at example.com/world, we would use hreflang equals xdefault, and basically anyone who isn't satisfied by any of the previous hreflang code that we've shown in these examples would land on this country selector page. Or we could pick any kind of global homepage to land people on who may be from a country that we don't expect a lot of traffic from, so really wouldn't want to dedicate a lot of resource into translating content and creating a new website for. So that goes through the implementation of hreflang in the page code. I'm just going to touch upon just slightly on the XML sitemap implementation. Now we've found this a lot more popular for sort of larger and enterprise scale websites because it's much easier to manage and really understand exactly how the hreflang is implemented and not have to go into each individual page and apply it at that kind of level. It basically requires the addition of certain modules within a regular XML sitemap file. So this is how a very basic XML sitemap file would look. The middle line where it opens with the LOC, that's basically showing the location of one of the URLs on our website. Typically, most websites would have an XML sitemap which details the location of all the URLs on their website to make it much easier for search engines to crawl. Now this here, which looks a lot more complicated, is sort of an expanded XML sitemap which contains references for the hreflang tags. Now a lot of these elements are the same, such as the language that we're speaking in and the location of the URL, but this section here is the addition, so xhtml:/link, and then you'll recognize underneath the same tags as we actually saw within the page code, so rel alternate, hreflang and the language, and href and the URL. So all of the elements are actually very similar, if not identical, it's just implemented in a different way. One thing to note is the reference to itself, so that's one thing that was part of the page code implementation and is also part of the XML sitemap implementation. We'd always recommend having a self-referencing hreflang tag in there as well. It makes it much easier for Google to build a clear picture of how your website is structured, but it also really helps with implementation and management from what we've found. So moving on from hreflang, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Google Search Console, which previously was known as Webmaster Tools. It rebranded about 12 months ago now. What we'd always recommend is to set up all your websites within Google Search Console as a property. Now these can be done at any kind of level. They can be done at top level, so .fr, .co.uk, subfolder, .com/fr, and also subdomain. So any kind of depth of your website and domain structure, that can all be managed within Google Search Console. And what Google Search Console allows you to do is target users in a specific region if you wish to do this. So that's under search traffic, international targeting, and then on the country tab. So if you were to tick that box and then target users in, you could select a country from that drop-down arrow and be really specific with the content within that Search Console property. Any top-level domains that are country-specific, it will auto-detect the target country, and you can't change that. So you can't start to rank a .co.uk site within the US, and so on and so forth. However, going deeper than this, you really can be a lot more specific. So any kind of generic global domain, such as .com or .org, subdomain level or subfolder level, they can all be set up as properties within Google Search Console and managed with the International Targeting Report. One point to note is that you can be really restrictive with your website's coverage by using this report, so it does need to be used with care. For example, you wouldn't want to target your French content to France if you also wanted to gain traffic from Canada and perhaps Switzerland. So what we recommend in this case is you tick the box and from the drop-down arrow select unlisted, which basically indicates to Google that this content, this website is not specific to any one particular country, and therefore you're able to gather traffic from a number of different sources. However, if that's not the approach you want to take and you do want to be specific, then by all means use the International Targeting Report in Google Search Console. So moving on now, I'm just going to talk about some of the more common mistakes, common pitfalls that we have seen clients and prospects fall into through working on various websites. And the first one is not implementing hreflang at page level. So here's an example of our hreflang code for our home page. So this would appear on all websites. So we've got our French, Spanish, Italian, and also English, US content there. And this would be an example of hreflang on our page1.html. So you'll notice that the middle part of that code where the URL is, that's changed. It's really important to ensure that the code on the page accurately reflects the exact alternative and exactly where it resides. Another common error, this is more with regards to site structure, and one that we do see very often actually, and it's quite difficult to manage, is setting up a website or targeting a website that targets regional users. In this example I've used European, but Latin America, APAC, EMEA could all be applied to this. So the example that here is example.com/EU or eu.example.com. Now because Europe is not a recognized ISO region, that's International Standards Organization, basically they decide the language and country codes that are used, internationally recognized codes. Europe is not recognized a directive, so it can't be targeted with hreflang. We could use hreflang EN for all English or hreflang xdefault for all other, but the consideration here is it may gather non-European traffic, which we probably wouldn't want to do. So an example of a piece of hreflang code that really wouldn't work is one that's highlighted here, EN EU, English for Europe. That just simply wouldn't be recognized by Google because it doesn't fall within the ISO region directive that would be recognized. EN would be fine, or xdefault would be fine. However, take into consideration that the previous bullet point that you may gather non-European traffic for your European website, which is probably not something that you do want to do. So I'd really encourage people to stay away from this sort of website structure. However, there are ways of managing it. It's just a lot more complicated than breaking down by country or language level. Another common error is missing return links. So what I'm talking about here is if a piece of content references another piece of content with hreflang code, that second piece of content must reference back. So if we've got our home page on our US website, we're referencing French, Spanish, and Italian. If I was to take a bad example of our code from our French website, you'll notice that the EN US reference is missing. That needs to go in there to make that valid hreflang code. Otherwise, Google will not build a true picture of all the content on our website. The easiest way, the truly easiest way of managing hreflang code is just to copy the same code for the page and copy it to every appropriate alternate page. So that top batch, the 4 lines, just copy that onto the French homepage, Spanish homepage, Italian homepage. then you ensure that each page is self-referencing, but also references back to any other pages. But an important part to note is only to reference when an alternate page exists. So if, for example, we didn't have an Italian homepage, we wouldn't need to make one up. We'd just need to not include that within the code. That's mostly applicable at sort of item or product page level when catalogs differ per country. If a certain item isn't available within a certain country, simply remove it from the hreflang code rather than referencing the next best alternative or the previous category up, because that usually causes more problems than it does solve. Another error that we see, not too common, but it has happened once or twice, is referencing the country but not the language. hreflang is a language tag primarily, so it is a requirement. The country is always optional. So examples here that wouldn't be valid hreflang code would be to have hreflang US, hreflang GB. These are not recognized language codes. What they'd need to be would be EN-US and EN-GB. These are actually valid because they are, as well as being country codes, it's the same as a language code. So those are totally valid. The previous two are invalid and wouldn't be recognized by Google. Redirecting users based on IP address is probably one of the most common issues that we find that sits away from hreflang really. It's typically seen as very good from a usability point of view because it always ensures that users will find the content that's relevant to them. However, there are instances where this would be an issue and wouldn't actually be relevant for the user. So just to visualize, if we had an American user attempting to access our UK English page, we would detect the IP address of this user and redirect them to our American page. That's great for most American users. However, if I was an American user in Britain, a British user in America, I'd want to access the British version and I wouldn't want to keep getting redirected to America simply because that's where I was residing, maybe if I was on holiday. Also, the biggest impact from an SEO point of view is Googlebot conducts all of its crawls from America. So whenever it attempts to access our British content, it always gets redirected to our American content, meaning that it won't crawl the British content or Spanish or Italian or French or any of our other multilingual or international content that we have live on our website. So it's certainly one approach that I tend to recommend people steer away from. There are some workarounds. It can be very, very complicated. So it's typically better just to use a well-structured website, hreflang, and geo-targeting in Search Console in order to satisfy what people are attempting to achieve with IP redirection. Additionally, dynamic serving of content based on location, so cookie IP address or login details. This is typically served on one single URL. So to give you another visual example, if we had our Italian user attempting to access our American content, it would detect the location, the server would detect the location of that Italian user and change the content so it displayed it in Italian. Now you'll notice here that the URL has not actually changed. So there's no unique URL for the Italian content. Google is only going to see the first instance of the content, which is English for America, and it will never see the Italian content. So this site in this example is really going to gain no kind of visibility in Italy or for Italian users. I would say that if you have the capability of translated content for a local region, then structure your website accordingly in order to gain that maximum level of visibility. Another error that we see sometimes is poor internal linking. So what we really want to do is make sure that search engines can find all of our content on all of our websites and ensuring that they're as well linked together as possible. It also helps to pass authority across all of the international websites. Going back to some of the initial slides where I was talking about the CCTLD approach, where each website was unique and sat on its own and there wasn't much sharing of that authority, using effective internal linking can help pass some of this authority through standard links on the web, just as you would gain links from any kind of outreach program. So it's really important to ensure that your websites are effectively internally linked a couple of good examples, again, to go back to the previous brands that we were discussing. Apple is probably my favorite example to give for internal linking. They have a page which is Choose Your Country, where they simply list the flag and the name of every country, and these are simple crawlable links that will point to that country subfolder. And it's a really good way of just directing as much link authority as possible to any kind of new countries that they want to target and really want to gain some short-term visibility in. Coca-Cola as well do this effectively, although perhaps not in the prettiest way possible. So they'll have their global page on coca-cola.com, and then you can select a region, so North America all the way through to Asia Pacific. And then when you select your region, so in this case I've selected Europe, it will make appear a list with all the European countries and specific languages. So you'll see the one right at the end. There's two different versions of Switzerland for the different languages that Coca-Cola have for that country. So to summarize the points that I've gone through today, hreflang really needs to be used for duplicate content for different countries and for translated content across different languages and countries. Essentially any kind of international structure or any kind of international strategy with different content, hreflang needs to be used to give as much indication to Google as possible about how that content should be served. Really try to avoid redirection and certainly dynamic serving of content based on location. You are severely restricting Google's crawl and ultimately your organic search visibility by taking this approach. So it's really something to avoid, or it's a case of finding a very complicated way around trying to get that content indexed and crawled. Make sure your content can be found through effective internal linking. I gave two examples there, but there's numerous more examples across the web of big brands who do this really well, so definitely take a look at some of those. And finally, use Google Search Console for more geo-targeting options. Search Console is a really, really useful hub for webmasters where they can sort of configure their website, understand traffic information, traffic stats, and crawl errors and crawl data from Google. So I'd really encourage you to set up Search Console for as many of your properties as possible, because another point to note about Search Console is that the data is sampled per property. So the more that you set up, the more data you're going to gain on your website as a whole. So that wraps up everything that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to hand back over to Alan, who will be taking some questions now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. That was great. And there's some real deep technical expertise that you've shared there that obviously you've accumulated with your team over the years. We've had a few questions come in, so everyone, don't leave yet. There's some good questions come in that may be relevant to you, and there's still time for you to ask your own questions. So let's start with the first question. Jamie, you mentioned that French users prefer the .fr ccTLD. Are there any other countries that prefer and trust ccTLDs over generic domains?
The only one that I am truly aware of is France and Germany to an extent, but from our experience, really, from working on client campaigns here, working on French websites and targeting France is the one recommendation that we put forward to really try and consider the use of the .fr top-level domain. However, whether it justifies taking that approach of using that country code top-level domain and basing the entire strategy upon that is certainly one that I would want to weigh up. I wouldn't want to go on one side of the fence and really commit to say that you must use a top-level domain for France or you must not for other countries, because there's so many other considerations that come into play that probably are more important and more influential as well. But to answer the question, France is the one that I'm most aware of, and Germany to an extent.
Great, thanks Jamie. And the questions are coming through thick and fast, so let's see how many we can work through. Second question, Jamie, how can I tell if I have errors in my hreflang?
Okay, so if you have your website set up as a property within Google Search Console, then this is the way to do it. So if you go to the international targeting report that I showed in the slides and click on the language tab as opposed to the country tab, then this will show you exactly where the errors are, the nature of the error, and also the URLs that you need to address. So that's exactly the place to go. There are some probably more complex ways of understanding any pages that don't contain hreflang or contain incorrect hreflang through certain crawling and using regular expressions, but we are getting very complex there. The first place to go is definitely the Search Console property for your website. That's why I'd say it's so important to get that set up.
Okay, the next question, again this is one for you, Jamie. Is the hreflang code only needed for subdirectories, or do we need to use them if we have ccTLDs or subdomains too?
Yeah, I would recommend utilizing hreflang across, no matter what structure you adopt. Yeah, basically wherever your alternate content resides, subfolder, subdomain, or unique domains, it needs to be referenced with hreflang.
Nice short answer, yes. Next question, does it make sense to implement hreflang tags on a single language site?
That wouldn't be necessary because the purpose of the hreflang tag is to identify alternate language versions of that piece of content. So if you have no alternate versions for different languages, then the hreflang code is unnecessary. So no, it's not needed if there's only one language.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Next question, I currently use ccTLDs. Should I switch to subfolders?
It's a good question, and it's one that we've had a few times. We've seen a number of brands who have moved from ccTLDs to subfolders and moved the other way. I'm going to be really annoying and say that there's no direct answer. I would really want to take into account how well established the existing websites are, how much visibility they have, how well do they rank, is there plenty of traffic coming to the website, and also the sort of motivations behind why that client or why that brand might want to move to subfolders. If it's purely just to gain the overall link authority of that domain, will that really give the benefit that's needed based on what they're currently gaining in terms of visibility? There can also be some risks of migrating. So let's say this brand had 10 websites and they were moving them all into one website. There's quite a lot of visibility that could potentially be sort of risked there, not in terms of lost completely, but there may be some percentage drops in visibility. So it's weighing up the benefits versus the potential drawbacks of making that move. So I wouldn't want to commit. I would really weigh up each individual situation.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Next question. If there's no chance your business will get rid of geofencing, is it worth the risk to cloak your website? For instance, letting Google's user agent get around your IP redirection.
We've sort of had similar conversations in the past. It's probably not as serious as when Google uses the term cloaking. It means serving Google one piece of content and serving the users another piece of content, but it's often done in malicious and spammy ways. I think that allowing Googlebot around your IP redirection, which I assume is what the question alludes to, that probably wouldn't be as severe or as serious as sort of what Google would term as cloaking. So again, I wouldn't want to sort of give a yes or no answer on this one, but I think if it's possible to be done and that the content that's being served is not wildly different from the users versus the search engines, then it's certainly an approach that I'd be exploring, because it's one way of getting around IP redirection, certainly, but I don't believe it's easy from the discussions that I've had with developers in the past.
Some good questions coming in. I think we've got time for just a couple more. So the next question is, what if I have different content on different country blogs? Do I need hreflang?
The hreflang, again, the hreflang code is for direct alternate versions of a piece of content. So if the content is completely separate and serves a completely separate purpose, then hreflang isn't needed. It's really just to identify, it's to make sure that users find the right piece of content for their language, and if that content differs completely, then they should have no problem finding that content in the first place anyway. So yeah, if the content is completely different, serves a different purpose, hreflang isn't needed because it's not necessarily an accurate reflection of how your website's structured anyway.
Great, thanks. So the last question I think we've got time for today. Do you have any recommendations for setting up a cross-domain cookie that remembers the user's language or country preference? The questioner says, I've seen a brand with ccTLDs that uses a redirect URL to set the cookie, but that creates problems with unnecessary redirects.
Yeah, we've seen similar in the past as well, and it can often bring in 302 redirects into the process, which really is difficult and can prove problematic for search engines despite what they might have you believe. I would always try to solve the problem with hreflang, geo-targeting setup and a correct domain structure before starting to explore sort of utilizing cookies and redirects based on location and previous activity. Also, the user cookie wouldn't necessarily affect Googlebot as much, but it still probably would affect the crawl. Similar to the IP redirection, to be honest, it effectively has the same purpose and ultimately same results. So I'd really want to steer away from that. Speaking from an SEO point of view, I'd really want to structure things correctly and try and do things as clean as possible, so to speak. However, we have dealt with many websites who utilize approaches like these, and it proves difficult, and sometimes they don't gain the visibility that they could do.
Great, thank you very much, Jamie. Well, we're coming to the end of the time we've allocated for today. I hope you've answered the questions you attended to find answers to. If you haven't, please do let us know. We'll be delighted to have a longer conversation with you about your own particular requirements. I'd also flag up a couple of things. We specialize in working with our North American clients to help them access international markets. We do have a lot of technical SEO experience and a good team here that Jamie's just been describing our expertise, but our services also include content, online PR, pay-per-click, programmatic and display, social, paid and organic, and we have a very strong data and analytics team based in the company as well. So whatever your goals, whatever marketing channels you're targeting, please let us know if you have outstanding questions for how better to access new markets. One final thought, now is a particularly good time for North American companies to target Europe, because the cost of buying media and clicks, and therefore the cost of new customer acquisition is a lot lower, probably about 15% lower than it was 3 months ago as a result of the strong dollar. So if you want to come into these markets, or you want to ramp up your international activities, please do let us know. On the screen there are the contact details for our Senior VP for the Americas, Chris, who is currently over at PubCon in Las Vegas. So if you happen to be over in Las Vegas and you've taken some time out to attend our webinar, please, only be delighted to hear from you, or let us know and we can set up a call at your own convenience. Thank you very much for attending. We hope you have a great day.